Does the road to the Kentucky Derby run through Tappan Street? Let's find out on this Spotlight Series. Everyone, Matthew DeSantis here with NYRA Bets, here with another preview of the Kentucky Derby Contender Spotlight Series as we talk about Brad Cox's Tappan Street on this episode. But before we get into this very intriguing runner coming off a Florida Derby victory, I want to remind you to press that like button and subscribe to NYRA Bets YouTube today. Subscribing is entirely free of cost, just notifies you when new videos drop on the channel, such as race previews, full card analyses, handicapping and betting tutorials, weekly programs, and special episodes like this one. Listen, folks, we got you covered for the Derby, the Triple Crown, Saratoga, the Breeders' Cup, everything focused on horse racing and handicapping. So press that like and subscribe button today. All right. Well, listen, let's talk about Tappan Street, a horse I really like, trained by Brad Cox, but has some negatives, has some positives. Is a horse that is very lightly raced, but is improving every race. Needs to get faster, but has shown the ability to get faster. Has a good running style, but is he going to get burned up front? So there are some questions, I think, on both sides with Tappan Street, but I do like this colt quite a bit. And let's talk about this, like I said, for trainer Brad Cox. And this is a trainer who's had a ton of success, obviously. A lot of Breeders' Cup victories, a lot of big wins for Brad Cox over his career already. But he has a Kentucky Derby victory. We should say he has a Kentucky Derby victory, too, with Mandaloun. Now, if you remember, Mandaloun crossed the wire second that day to Medina Spirit. Medina Spirit, who was, of course, then disqualified for having 19 picograms too much of betamethasone in his system. And that led to a long, drawn-out legal battle between Churchill Downs and Bob Baffert. But ultimately, Medina Spirit was disqualified. Mandaloun was awarded the Kentucky Derby in 2021. But you have to imagine that Brad Cox is motivated to have a horse cross the wire first in the Kentucky Derby, and that's certainly what he's hoping for in Tappan Street. Jockeyed by Luis Saez, obviously a jockey who, no stranger to the Triple Crown, has a lot of experience there, has a lot of experience in big races, a very strong jockey in terms of really pushing his horses that last stretch. Luis, pound for pound, one of your stronger jockeys that you're always going to see. Now, from a standpoint of pedigree, I mentioned this on the Sovereignty episode. I don't love the Into Mischief influence up top. Into Mischief is a sire who I think generally produces outstanding milers and potentially going up to a mile and an eighth. Think a horse like Life is Good, who was by Into Mischief. Life is Good was an outstanding horse in a mile. Mile and a 16th was a very, very good horse. Mile and an eighth could get it under the right circumstances. But anything beyond that was a little bit of a question mark, as we saw in the Breeders' Cup Classic, where he just got absolutely burned up by Flightline. Although that's a once-in-a-generation horse, so you don't want to hold that against him too much. But still, the point being, Into Mischiefs are not known for getting that classic distance. Now, that said, he has sired two Kentucky Derby winners, but, there's always a but, one was via disqualification, and the other was with in the COVID year. So there were a little bit of asterisks there with Into Mischief as a sire for the Kentucky Derby. Some of the horses that you'll see sired by Into Mischief have great influence in terms of stamina and distance underneath. That's not necessarily the case with Tappan Street. Distorted Humor, a little bit more of a sprinter, miler influence underneath. Not necessarily a horse that's known for producing great distance in his offspring. And so with the dam being by Distorted Humor, again, a little bit of a question mark there. Is he going to like getting the mile and a quarter? I think that's the big question with Tappan Street for sure. He is a lightly raced horse. He finished second in the Holy Bull. That was flattered a little bit because the horse he lost to that day was Burnham Square. Burnham Square came back and won the Bluegrass later on in that Kentucky Derby prep season. So it was good to see him, at least if he's going to finish second to a very good horse. And then obviously winning that Florida Derby is kind of the crown jewel right now in his resume, because his resume is only 3 races deep. That's right. This is one of the most lightly raced horses that you're going to see in the field for trainer Brad Cox. This horse broke its maiden in debut at Gulfstream Park, going 7 furlongs. This should show you the confidence that they had in this $1 million purchase out of the Fasig-Tipton Saratoga August sale, where after a 7 furlong victory, and 7 furlongs is a tough distance to break your maiden, admittedly, They stepped him up immediately to the Holy Bull, grade 3 Kentucky Derby prep race. And he ran really well that day. Came from a little further back, was sitting, not that far off the pace, but was sitting kind of towards the back of that field, actually. And was able to pass horses, make up ground, get to the lead. But then Burnham Square kind of tracked him down. I thought track announcer Pete Aiello called a great race that day when he said, Tappan Street fired, but Burnham Square's just better. And that was a very accurate call, I thought, that Tappan Street ran his race. He got to the front. He got up into the lead. It was just Burnham Square ran a little bit better that day. And then he comes back in the Florida Derby and sits a very useful trip. Sits more of that tracking mid-pack trip, lets some of the speed go out in front of him, and then slowly just starts tracking horses down, gets to the front, and is able to hold off Sovereignty. Now, Sovereignty's making up some ground on him late, but not a massive amount of ground, though it could be argued maybe Sovereignty wasn't being asked for his absolute best at that point, or maybe not was cranked to his absolute 100%. But Tappan Street ultimately needed that Florida Derby victory to basically get into the Kentucky Derby because he didn't have it based upon the points he earned finishing second in the Holy Bull. So he really needed to finish first or second that day in the Florida Derby to qualify. And one of the things you'll notice here is with his speed figures. Those are those numbers in the middle that are bolded. He's gotten faster every race. 84, 87, 94. He needs to keep getting faster. A 94 isn't going to get the job done at the Kentucky Derby. Mystic Dan last year ran a 99. That was even a little light. A lot of times you see a Derby winner running 100, 104, somewhere in that range. And so he's going to need to get another 5-6 points faster, presumably, to really have a shot. Now, the good news is maybe he can. He's never taken a step back to this point, but he's also doing something he's never done before, which is going a mile and a 16th. One of the things I do like about him is he's run against decent field sizes, at least. So one of the critiques that I think you'll see when you look at a horse like Journalism, when you look at some of these other horses, even a horse like Sovereignty has not necessarily run against huge fields all the time. Well, he broke his maiden against 11 other runners in a 12-horse field. The Holy Bull was only 7, but then the Florida Derby was a 10-horse field. So, no, it's not the 20-horse field he's going to face the first Saturday in May, but it goes to show that he can run against a significant amount of other horses, find the right sort of a trip. He's had some good post positions those first 2 races, but that last race, he broke post position 9 out of 10. I mean, he broke a little further outside and had that short run up into the first turn at Gulfstream Park. So he has some versatility. The other thing I like about Tappan Street is I think people think he's a little bit more of a speedball than he actually is. He really is more of a mid-pack horse. When you look at mid-pack tracking, kind of a forward tracking horse, maybe. And what I mean by that is he's going to sit a trip maybe similar to Mystic Dan last year. He's not going to need to be up in the lead. So he's going to let horses like Rodriguez and Owen Almighty and maybe Neo Equos and East Avenue and, maybe, American Promise, maybe, 4 or 5 of those horses, depending on who breaks and how well they break, that sort of thing, and decisions certain jockeys make. That group of 4 or 5 horses, they're going to be contending for the lead. I would imagine Tappan Street is happy to sit behind that group. And he's probably going to be sitting 6, maybe 5, 6, 7 in that area. That's not a terrible spot to be in historically at the Kentucky Derby. You don't have as much traffic to contend with coming from the further back, like a horse like Sandman or Sovereignty will have to deal with. And if the pace doesn't materialize as fast as some think it might, and I think it might be a pretty fast pace, but if the pace for some reason is not as nuclear as it has been the last couple of years, then suddenly you're in a position where you don't have as much ground to make up, and you're not putting yourself behind the 8 ball because you'll be able to sit, 3-4 lengths maybe off the pace. So I think he's got a useful running style. And like I said, he's not a horse that needs to be sitting second or third. Like, that's not his game. He can sit, as you saw, sat more mid-pack. He sat 4th out of 10. In the 7-horse race, he was sitting 6th at one point out of 7. Even then moving up to sitting 3rd out of 7, still more of a mid-pack trip. So again, I think he's a horse that has a little bit more versatility than we give him credit for in terms of that running style. He can be close, but he doesn't have to be. He can pass horses. He's shown that ability, which is always promising with a young horse. Can they pass other horses? So many times horses like to go straight to the front and not look back. Certainly seems to be the case with a horse like East Avenue or a Rodriguez or Citizen Bull, who have never really shown the ability to pass horses. So Tappan Street's got a lot going for him in that regard. He needs to get faster, and that's going to be a huge question mark for him moving forward. But he's a horse that handicappers are going to point out that he doesn't have a 2-year-old foundation. And they're right. He doesn't. I mean, technically, he's got one race as a 2-year-old, but not really. A lot of times you like to see a horse that has foundation, that has that ability to have run few races as a 2-year-old, come in as a 3-year-old, run on a few different preps, has just that more conditioning, more muscle to them, more experience. You really like to see that a lot of times. You're not going to see that with Tappan Street. But quite frankly, there's a lot of horses in this generation that are lightly raced and improving. You look at a horse like Grande, certainly fits that description. Maybe a horse like Baeza, if he draws in, fits that description as well. Even a horse like Journalism, only 5 career starts. So not a lot of these horses have tons of experience. Tappan Street has the least amount of it. You know, he and Grande both have 3 starts. So they are the most inexperienced of the group, but he could absolutely make some impressions here. I'm interested how he works out. Cox's horses always work out so well. Cox is one of those trainers who knows how to get horses ready for big races. I think the big question with Tappan Street is, what's his price going to be? You know, people are going to see that Florida Derby victory, and that's going to put a lot of weight in that. But I have a feeling he's not quite in that. He's not solidly in that second group, because I do think it's the kind of Journalism and then the kind of Sovereignty, Sandman. I think a horse like Tistastic is getting a lot of buzz. And maybe he's in the lower end of that group. But if he's that 10-1, 12-1 range, that's an interesting price for a horse like Tappan Street. I wouldn't want to take a very short price on him because he doesn't have that 2-year-old foundation. He does need to get faster. There is projection there. I am questioning his pedigree. I don't think he's going to necessarily love the 1.25 mile distance, but he could get the right type of trip. And sometimes trips outweigh pedigree. That can happen sometimes. So we'll have to see where he draws, have to see how the final field ends up in terms of the pace scenario, but he's a horse to certainly take a long look at when you're dissecting the Kentucky Derby. All right. Well, thanks again, friends, for tuning into this episode of Kentucky Derby Contenders Preview Spotlight. My name is Matthew DeSantis, wishing you a great and profitable day at the races, and reminding you, friends, it's now post time.